So, Susan, over to you.
Thank you, Rod. Well, welcome everybody. It's so good to see your faces, many of whom we've seen before and you're just like part of the team now. So welcome to our very first climate webinar of 2022, Glasgow and Climate Policies 201. Now, Randy actually has a better title for his presentation, and I'll let him present that to you. This is what we had advertised earlier before I got his title. So we've continued to use this, but his title is much better than mine. So I just want you to know that. Let's look at the January focus then. If you could go to the next slide, Rod. We've got a brief overview of what's coming up. Our follow-up conversation, which you'll see on the next slide, will occur in 2 weeks' time. It's January 23rd, and Randy will be present to answer questions for us. So if there are questions that are not answered today, then please go ahead and come back on the 23rd, and Randy would be available to answer them then. We are working on bringing to you a webinar on eco-racism. And it's tentatively scheduled for February. We're working on that. So as we continue to promote our vision of sustainable flourishing of life for all, we have that topic that if it is not in February, we will have a different topic, and that one will be coming up very soon, possibly in March. I wanted to alert you because it's such an important topic of eco-racism. So there are the dates for the conversation and the climate webinar in February, and you will be getting further announcements on those, of course, as you always do. So in today's webinar, we consider the recent gathering of international leaders from around the globe in Glasgow, who assembled once again, as they do every year, although this was a special year, to consider climate change, to talk about the commitments they've made in the past to decreasing carbon emissions, and see if they can figure out a way forward. Randy will share with us the results of that gathering, and then in the second half, he will surprise us with a scenario of hope in spite of the disappointments from government officials. Randy's the chairman of Seattle's 34th District Environment, Energy and Land Use Caucus, and a climate mitigation advocate who's been functioning in that way for many years. He teaches high school, specializes in policy and social issues. He also leads a UN simulation game that is patterned somewhat after the COP26 event in Glasgow. It deals with global policies and funding for climate mitigation. And it highlights the importance of nations working together to solve the crisis we face. And at some point, we hope to have Randy involved with us in sharing that simulation game. Randy will pick up questions from the chat box, as I mentioned, so be sure and put them in there as the webinar goes on, and he will answer them during the presentation as long as we can get to all of them. We also are blessed to have two of the members from Clay Cross Community of Christ with us from Derbyshire, England, Andrew Fellows and Michael Clark. Michael is the artist, and there's some of his work. They are climate advocates and activists, and they've participated in many peaceful protests for climate justice in England. They both went to COP26 and were actually there in person. And they participated in the New Year's Eve climate prayer vigil, where they shared their experiences and helped lead us in the early morning hours. So if you're interested in what they shared at the prayer vigil, you can go to our website and click on the archives for the videos of past events. Okay, next slide, please. I just want to remind you that we are a nonprofit religious organization, and therefore we have to be careful that we are nonpartisan. Neither Randy nor the climate justice team promotes any political candidate or party over another. And so as you speak or write, please keep your own comments strictly nonpartisan in the chats or in the larger group. If you do need to name a political party or candidate, be sure that you also uphold the opposite party in some way so that we can't be accused of being partisan. Okay, let's get going, Randy. Thank you for being here and for sharing with us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Let me go ahead and share my screen here next, and we'll get all the technical pieces in place here for it, as it were. Well, again, pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the generous introduction. I look forward to this opportunity today to again share here with the community of Christ and your climate colloquy. It was my pleasure to be joining you back in October as well. And if you recall, for those of you that were there for that presentation, I had the opportunity to share with you a little bit about policy and some elements that I think would bring a bit of a more hopeful take than what we conventionally receive. When we think about climate, so often we end up in gloom and doom. And I framed that last presentation as climate hope or climate doom, and I think gave us some reasons to at least look for some of the slivers of hope that are out there, at the very least, so that we would be compelled to continue to take action. Well, today, as was introduced and as I was asked to do, I'm here to share a bit about Glasgow, more the kind of from 30,000 feet views, which I share contextually with my students all the time when I'm talking about it, and get a sense of what was accomplished there, where things may have come up short, and then to go beyond that, as Susan said, and to dig into an area that has been some new learning for me here in the last few months. I've been following it off and on for the last few years, but it's been a deep dive for me. And I hope to share that as credibly as I can here over our time together today. As Susan mentioned, I will be following along certainly in the chat space for your questions, and I'll do my best to follow those as I can. But if I miss something, I know I can count on Susan to provide us a little bit of a nudge there and for me to try to direct it before I move on. If you're more comfortable with it, we can wait on your questions until the end. I'll try to provide some space for that there. So with that all said, let's take a look at it all. I wanted to start out with this frame in terms of the image, a little street art from Glasgow that I think gives us a sense of what's squarely in the bullseye here. Note the context. There's so much going on that surrounds this issue when we consider everything from locally led action, accountability, the realities of what's happening to our oceans, the power of global youth in this, and then a whole host of other pieces. But at the center of it all is this idea of keeping 1.5 alive with no overshoot. And the challenge really to the international community has been, how do we get to that mark? How do we get to that space without going over in terms of our goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius increase over pre-industrial temperatures and not surpassing that here in this century? Well, that's the challenge. And I think for those of you who have followed Glasgow at all, in terms of what's projected, well, 1.5 is a very rosy scenario compared to what we will see here today. But I think that there's more to it. And part of the challenge of this presentation is helping you understand what was accomplished at Glasgow, but also what is happening beyond that, and a chance for us to kind of give that some consideration for it. So let's look into that here as we can proceed. The first part then is all about the Conference of the Partners, COP26, as Susan said, in Glasgow. And we'll start with the basics of who attended. This was the biggest conference of the partners ever. 37,000 delegates representing 197 nations attended. You had most countries attended with high-level delegations. There was a lot of press about that with the United States and other countries as far as our principal leadership that was there. Russia and China were present, but they were somewhat lower-level delegations in that, which received a bit of scrutiny as well. And of course, beyond the delegates themselves, I think a lot of the real action was happening there on the streets as a statement of organization, as a statement of protest, including 100,000 people from 100 organizations on Friday, November 5th, at the height of the conversations in Glasgow. And that was supplemented by demonstrations in 100 other nations. And there's been some question here in the last, particularly 2 years since COVID started in March of 2020, about what would happen with these mass protests that have been really dominating much of the headlines in Europe and beyond. Well, like with everything during COVID, there was a bit of a hiatus, but I think Glasgow was a sign that in terms of public organization, at least for that moment, that climate army, as the UN Secretary General addressed them, I think favorably, is still out there. They are motivated, they're ready to push. And we need that push. That's a big part of the lesson today, that no matter what I'm going to be sharing with you here, it's ultimately one of the big pieces for us. Question from Kate about the fossil fuel industry being the largest entity that was there. And ultimately, I think we have to consider certainly fossil fuel delegates in terms of their willingness to influence. They were present. Absolutely, they were. They have a vested interest in what's happening at these conference of the partners. But in terms of size and influence, let's play out the presentation. We'll see what you think in terms of influence and where things are going. No doubt, fossil fuel companies were there and attempting to exert pressure. Certainly the coal industry was present, but others were as well as part of that. I think in terms of presence, if we can consider some of the voices, and we'll hear more about that in a little bit from Andrew and from Michael in terms of their portion of the presentation today. But one of the voices that was, I think, maligned over the last couple of years was that of Vanessa Nakate from Uganda. She famously, of course, was spliced out of a picture of some of the young climate activists. She, of course, being the sole African member in terms of the photograph that was taken. The rest were all very white young people. But I think her voice and her persistence speaks in a lot of ways as a microcosm for the movement itself, attempting to push no matter what the circumstances. And just in terms of her statement, I'll share this briefly for you. The latest available science tells us that in order to avoid the worst impacts of the global climate crisis, we must reduce global CO2 emissions by somewhere between 7 to 11% this year and next year and every year after year until we get to zero. So understanding that statement of power and certainly of frustration there is an important part of what we're considering. And really, the reality of it is that without those climate advocates doing what they're doing, it would be so much more difficult for us to achieve the progress that we need. So considering that, again, broad overview and the like, the challenge then becomes what was accomplished with all those different advocates coming from different directions at times, certainly in terms of what they wanted out of Glasgow. Let's consider a little bit the accomplishments that were there. In terms of accomplishments, one of the biggest ones that's been well touted, you probably heard about it, was that the biggest emitters have pledged to achieve net zero emissions by 2070. The United States by 2050, China by 2060, and India by 2070. Now, of course, I mean, we can respond to that very quickly in terms of whether that's adequate or not, but just helping you understand in terms of what has been accomplished, what sits there on the table for it. So understand that piece there in terms of those pledges. And ultimately as well, more than 130 nations pledged net zero emissions by 2050. And that is certainly favorable in terms of, at least on the surface for it. The reality of net zero and the challenge of that, of course, is that assumes that we would have a net of zero emissions, not an actual number of zero emissions, that the emissions beyond zero would be captured either by direct air capture, some technologies that we don't really have yet. And so that's a pledge that gets us well down the road, but not necessarily all the way there. And I'm going to talk about some numbers here that I want to be clear about, because when we think about best case scenario, the optimistic scenarios, I'll refer to it in a moment, if pledges are met, and the world is on course to warm to 1.9 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times by the middle of the century, before declining to 1.8 degrees Celsius by 2100. Of course, 1.2 degrees Celsius warming has already occurred to this point, to this moment. So when we think about that, that is the absolute best case scenario if all the pledges are met, if all those things that have been promised through Glasgow and previous conferences come to pass. We'll talk about where things actually are at the moment, but we'll get to that in a second. So in terms of optimism, that's where the numbers kind of sit at the moment as far as the pledges there. One of the areas that received the most scrutiny was this question about the fossil fuel subsidies and certainly coal power. Now, coming into the Glasgow, you heard from the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, for example, Boris Johnson, who famously said he wanted to consign coal to the ash bin of history with this conference. That did not happen, and you probably shouldn't be terribly surprised that didn't happen. But language was included that was first phrased as efforts towards phase out of unabated coal power and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. But that line is deliberately there for phase out, and instead it became effort towards phase down of unabated coal power and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Why was that put in place? Why was that language changed? Well, that was the insistence of two of the biggest polluters in terms of countries in the world, China and India. And they have their reasoning, I suppose. For China, of course, they are slowly reducing the percentage of their electrical generation that comes from coal, but they are also continuing to export that to other countries as part of their market share strategies and the like. India, of course, is sitting on a vast reserve of coal. And as a nation that has hundreds of millions of people who have no access to electricity yet, their argument is that they should be allowed to continue coal, at least in some level, since it's so cheap and plentiful. That's the argument. And that explains a little bit why phase out was changed to phase down. Now, for anyone who follows that in terms of understanding that coal is simply death for the planet if it continues to be allowed to be harvested and utilized for any kind of combustion, that is certainly disappointing news and something for us to consider here as far as how viable that will be going forward. Probably one of the best accomplishments that didn't quite receive the headlines I think it deserved was a section of the Conference of the Partners agreement here from COP26, Article 6. Which in part of the agreement talks about rules governing carbon markets, that they are clarified and strengthened to prevent double counting of emissions credits. I mean, it's all well and good if, say, one country is able to account for some of their emissions in terms of credits. But what if the country next door simply counts the exact same action as a credit for them too? That's been a problem up until now. And what we're seeing here is that along with a requirement for a detailed inventory of greenhouse gas emissions by 2024, shows that the international community is starting to clarify the rules. It's not going to be as easy anymore to be able to cut corners and to double count to make you look good while doing terrible things for the planet. So those are changes that are happening. And I think that's the result of pressure. That's something we have to give credit to the protesters for and those who have continued to push for the changes that we are needing to see. Coming up short, areas where we would certainly like to see more results in that would include the following. Current policies, what's actually in place right now, not the pledges, not the promises that have not yet been turned into policy, but current policies, what sits right now in terms of national policy across the globe at the moment. They would lead to 2.7 degrees Celsius warming by 2100, which is well beyond the minimum threshold to avoid climate catastrophe. I'll show you more about that in a good graphic here in a moment. But understanding that as far as where we sit, that's where things sit on the ground. That doesn't include the pledges and promises yet. We'll get to those again in a moment. Also, not all countries upgraded their ambition with new nationally determined contributions, that's NDCs, leading up to the Conference of the Partners, which, as I mentioned last time in my previous presentation, is a major part. Leading up to the Conference of the Partners is always as big a deal in terms of the promises and the like to ratchet up ambition as the actual event itself. Current commitments remain voluntary. And that's always a point of frustration for activists, I'm sure. The reality is, in terms of the international community, there's not enough level of trust and political goodwill to go with anything more than voluntary at the moment. So that limits the likelihood of staying under 2 degrees Celsius warming, let alone 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's one of the hard facts that's on the ground for us. There was also a failure to reach $100 billion in annual mobilization for climate-related financing in developing countries, which was a pledge that comes to us from several years ago, the promise that we would have $100 billion a year coming from wealthy countries to developing countries to help finance and to fund ultimately their transition to renewable sources and cleaner energy. We did not achieve that by 2020. We have yet to achieve it. And by now, certainly the numbers are only going up as far as the need and the like, not just for mitigation, but increasingly there's push for money for adaptation to be able to deal with the consequences we're already starting to see, whether that be wildfires, rising sea levels, or the like. So these are challenges that we're facing that the international community has yet to completely rally behind. We came out of this Conference of the Partners with no funding mechanism in place for damages to developing nations. That's not necessarily new. That's been the case for a long time. In fact, up until November, just when this conference happened in Glasgow, there was no conversation at all about this. It would be brought up by some of the developing nations, but it would be shot down instantly by the developed world, by wealthy countries. They would refuse even to consider it. The fact that this is going to be revisited and that a conversation is starting here now in 2022 as we move to the next conference is good news. It's a baby step, it has to be admitted. But it is good news that you're starting to see some discussion about this as far as the damages that have been done, really by the influence of people who have, well, for my family, 17 tons of carbon footprint every year versus those who have a tiny fractional footprint of that in the developing world. So this idea of damages, the conversation is finally starting. It's well belated, to be sure, but it's one that there's a little hope that we're having that as something that's going to be on the table. So bottom line, I know I'm throwing a lot at you here today. I appreciate it in terms of your willingness to listen. But bottom line here, as far as are we moving in the right direction? The answer is yes, but And part of that yes, but I think is well encapsulated here in terms of this slide. So let me explain a little what you're seeing. If you take a look at the thermometer here, this comes from Climate Action Tracker. Global mean temperature increased by 2100. We can see 0 degrees Celsius all the way up to the +4 degrees Celsius range. Well, policies in action, follow the line there from the top descriptor down here to the kind of blue range that's next to the thermometer. Policies in action there, this is what I was talking about based on real world action. What we're doing right now already that's in place in terms of national policies across the world is leading us to someplace between 2 degrees Celsius, which would be good news, to as much as 3.6 degrees Celsius. There's a lot of variance in that. And if you take more or less the middle path on it, that brings us to that plus 2.7 degrees Celsius. Which is obviously still a catastrophe for the planet, but noting that as far as what's in place now. If we include the 23 targets and turn those into policies that are in place, that brings us down a little bit to plus 2.4 degrees Celsius. And you can see pledges and targets, what we've heard a little bit about, and then getting to the optimistic scenario as well. Note how the numbers are shifting depending on what we're including. So that optimistic scenario, the best case scenario that we have full implementation of all the announced targets, including net zero targets and the like, that brings us to that promised number of plus 1.8 degrees Celsius by 2100. Is it good enough? No, of course not. I'm not going to tell you any different than that right now. But note how this represents movement, how this represents grinding progress over the last several years. And just 6 years ago, and look at my note there in the top right corner, in 2015, before the Paris Climate Accords, we were on track for plus 4.6 degrees Celsius warming with the policies in action that was in place, which was a lot more inaction than action. So in 6 years, you've seen a shift to move from a projected increase of plus 4.6, which is runaway catastrophe for the planet, to plus 2.7, which is certainly bad news. And the runaway scenario gets to be anything above 2 degrees Celsius warming is you've got 1 chance in 3 that you enter tipping points for the planet that we cannot stop. So you're flirting with disaster to be sure, anything beyond 2 degrees Celsius. And of course, you're saying goodbye to low-lying countries, the Marshall Islands, areas that are at or below sea level would face catastrophic flooding that would simply erase those countries anytime we're above 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we have to understand relative here to where we've been, where we're going, and some of the realities of where we are at the moment right now. Well, to go from somewhat an international focus and a very global conversation, let's turn our attention.
Randy?
Yeah, go ahead.
If I can interrupt you, there was a
Please.
question in the chat that you might want to address now since it works into this area right now.
Great, great. Yeah.
Kathy Sharp says, can you give us some specific examples of damages done to the developing world with regard to climate change? When you talked about damages being given, financial damage being given to them to mitigate what has happened, she would like some examples.
Sure, and I guess I read this one of two ways, Susan. I'm happy to comment on both of them. If you're talking about financial damages, monies that are being provided for wrong committed to developing countries, in effect, there isn't any right now, certainly not from the national governments. That's a conversation that's just starting here this year. So as of right now, there's no damages being paid in terms of financial recompense to developing countries by the developed world. You may see some pieces that are private philanthropy and the like, but those are, well, hard pressed to fill the need that's there. Because we're talking about tens of billions of dollars of damage that's being done by climate change every single year, and it disproportionately falls on the developing world. And even in the developed world, it disproportionately falls on Black and brown communities. So we don't have a structure for that right now that's anything that's credible beyond goodwill of a few individuals. So that's one version of the question, but I read it a little bit differently in terms of damages done to the developing world with regard to climate change, and some of which I just mentioned. The damage that's being done right now is rising sea levels, and those continue and are persisting. The damage that are being done are increased desertification in parts of sub-Saharan Africa for countries that were on the fringe of the Kalahari or Sahara Desert. As climate change advances, they're looking at increased drought. They're looking at desertification of areas that were just a few years ago cropland and fertile. We're seeing those changes. We're seeing heat waves, of course, and we're no stranger to that here in the Pacific Northwest after this past June, but those are happening elsewhere. And we're seeing flooding by freshwater sources in terms of rivers, particularly with increased storms and the like, the damages that are done, stronger hurricanes, which of course disproportionately impact developing parts of the world, more so than the developed part of the world. Those are all happening and have been happening already for the last several years. And what we can project is that they will simply increase in their intensity over the next decade or two. And beyond that, that depends on our actions now. So I hope that's a bit of an adequate reading for it in terms of the question. I'll jump ahead here into the next part then, but do feel free to keep the questions coming. And thank you, Susan, for keeping me aware of it. Lots to pay attention to here. If we consider the United States, since the conference, we can consider executive actions by President Biden that are related to the Conference of the Partners, one of which is new and one of which is kind of a follow-up on a previous executive order. So let's take a look at that here. On December 9th, so just a month ago, executive order by President Biden directing the federal government to buy clean with its annual $650 billion procurement budget. Now, the goal here ultimately is from the Biden administration to make sure that the monies the federal government is spending every year would follow certain guidelines about what they're buying with those dollars, with those taxpayer dollars. The federal government is the largest purchaser of anything in the United States and certainly one of the biggest on the planet. So every year they're buying all sorts of things, whether that's for a replacement of vehicles in their transportation fleet or a whole host of other things. You're talking about $650 billion a year in procurement. So if you have those monies going towards a buy clean model, then you're talking about a massive buyer that stimulates ultimately supply. You have the demand call that's there to the tune of $650 billion a year, and suppliers, businesses and the like that are building these goods for the federal government will have to respond to that if they want to continue to get that business. And believe me, the federal government is a favorite customer of a lot of businesses in the United States and really across the planet. So thinking about that, the potential for this is quite big, because if you're talking about suddenly one of the biggest procurer of goods in the whole country saying we're going to buy clean now, even if that is only a half measure in terms of what they implement, it's still a big deal. That will stimulate supply, that will force businesses to change some of their models in terms of what kind of products they're selling. That can be very good news. On December 10th, just the next day, there was interim guidance that was kind of the next step in a previous executive order that comes from last January. One of the first ones, I believe, that President Biden signed when he came into office. This interim guidance would restrict financial support for fossil fuel projects overseas that don't capture their own emissions. But there are exceptions to this, namely the old national security rule exception. So how much will this impact things? We have to consider that a little bit. I can see Kate's question in terms of the question about buy clean applying to the military. I think it certainly can, Kate, in terms of the impact of it, and also this question about financial support, not so much for the military, but for other projects that the United States traditionally supports. Buy clean certainly can. And I think that what's promising out of both of these is that you have the potential for the federal government to really start turn in terms of its regular functions that are oftentimes invisible to us, buying products, supporting different projects overseas, that increasingly is putting more scrutiny on that question of fossil fuel projects. The loophole in the second one with the interim guidance, the exceptions include things like those determined for national security. If there's not an alternative possible, then they would continue to do it the way that they've done it, which can oftentimes be a fairly dirty enterprise. So we have to watch that. And I think that there's some potential with that second one, probably more with the first in terms of where we are going. Okay. How has the United States responded? Looking at the state level, really throughout 2021, you saw a series of promising developments. We know that there's a number of states in the United States that already have passed elements about 100% carbon-free electricity or net zero emissions, including my state, Washington State, and several others. But we've had states added on to that. Illinois, Massachusetts, North Carolina, Oregon, Rhode Island. These are all states that have been added on this year through legislative action. And that shows promise, because the more states that you have that are going to be doing this, you're starting to shift the country, even at the state level. Even if the federal government, as we'll see in a moment, hasn't acted in every capacity they can, even if they haven't done this yet, you're talking about tens of millions of consumers in now nearly a dozen states that are increasingly living in a model that is what we hope to see across the country and really across the planet. Carbon-free electricity with goals that are no later than 2050, in many cases well before it, as you can see. This is a first major step in terms of what we're trying to see happen with that. So give that some consideration. And, you know, for those of you who have heard me before on this, David Roberts, my favorite climate journalist, he said, and I mentioned this in the last presentation, we really have to do two things on climate. One is we have to electrify everything and we have to green the grid. Well, these states are doing that. They're doing that very thing. Is it enough? No, it's not. But there's this funny thing that happens in American history as states increasingly shift with more and more numbers. You start to see that kind of work its way up to the thinking of the federal government. And some of what we'll see here next, I think, alludes to some of that. All right, are you ready for the, what's the number now? $1.75 trillion question? Sure you are. And that ultimately comes to this question of the Build Back Better bill. I had great fortune, actually, to be joined by my wife and then Susan's daughter and that daughter's husband in Washington, D.C. back in November. And we had a great trip there, just us without the kids. It was amazing. But we had the opportunity there to be, luckily enough, in Washington, D.C. when they passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which represented over $1 trillion investment in a whole host of things. That's good news in a lot of ways, because there's certainly help that it's going to provide. But on climate, the bipartisan infrastructure bill is probably generously a wash. For the good things that it does, well, when you're adding more roads and bridges and the like, that tends to negate it out a bit. The hope, certainly in climate circles, is this bill, the Build Back Better bill. And a version of it passed the House of Representatives, as you might recall here, within the last couple months. But ultimately, right now, we're waiting. We're waiting for what actually is going to happen in the Senate. The core provision of this is truly enormous. It's over $500 billion in renewable energy tax credits, which would easily be the largest ever investment in climate policy by the federal government. Much bigger than what we did previously under the Obama administration, which had its effects, most definitely. The $90 billion that was invested by the Obama administration through congressional appropriation helped set the table for what's happened in the last decade for particularly solar and batteries and the like that we'll get to more in a moment. Think about what big splash would happen from nearly $500 billion in renewable energy tax credits, a big carrot dangling in front of a variety of entities to pursue. There's also a methane fee, which would be part of that Build Back Better bill as passed by the House of Representatives, and a $12,500 EV rebate, which would be an extension of what we already have to keep it going, but also an expansion of it out by an additional $5,000 for each EV purchase. But the reality is those are being opposed by key senators right now that make passage all but impossible, at least in terms of the current Build Back Better bill that passed the House. What will happen? Well, I always hate to say wait and see, but right now, it depends on some of our action and our push, especially with certain recalcitrant members of the United States Senate. So that's very much in play. We will see what the focus is. The hope is that they'll be able to pass something that is a little slimmer in some of the other areas, but keep intact possibly all the climate provisions. So stay tuned with that one most definitely. Well, how do we continue to make progress then? And before we jump into the second part, I'll be introducing Andrew and Michael here again in a moment. But I want to leave you with these questions to think a little bit about with one part of your mind for the second part of the presentation. What elements are really driving progress in this? Because in a lot of ways, what you've heard me say in the first portion is that there's slow grinding progress at best. That national governments and the international community, we're seeing progress, but it certainly doesn't match the necessity of what we know needs to happen. So what's really driving progress in society? Is it national governments or is it something else? Well, my argument for the second part that I'll just preview briefly here is that it's really civic groups, the private sector and subnational governments, as we saw here in the United States with state governments, that have really become the engine that are driving the climate train in a positive direction. And some are even embracing patterns of market disruption. So if you'll pardon the cheesy graphic here, we're going to talk about engines and cabooses a little bit in part two. So we'll come back to that here in a few minutes. Before we do though, as was mentioned earlier, throwing it over to the likeness of Andrew Fellows and Michael Clark. We'll talk to you a little bit about their experience in Glasgow. So credit to them for doing the hard work on the ground. I'll cue up their bit here and we'll enjoy listening to them for a few moments of our time.
I'm from a city called Derby, And our congregation is Claycross in Derbyshire. And if you imagine Claycross in Derbyshire as being just slightly south of Manchester and Liverpool, but above Birmingham and way above London, you'll get a good indication about where we are. Michael?
Hi, my name's Michael Clark. I'm also from the Claycross congregation. I live in a small village that used to be a mining village, and that's me.
Okay, thank you, Michael. My name's Andrew Fellows. So I'm from the UK. We were talking about doing some protesting. We've done a bit with XR and with Christian Climate Action in the past. And we fancy going to this thing called COP26. So for those who don't know, COP26 is a meeting of 200 or so countries to try and get some ideas on how they're going to mitigate against climate changes that are coming. I think the main goals was to try and keep the world under the figure of 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels. But also there was going to be an established green fund, which would help pay smaller countries and countries who were feeling the effects of climate change money in order to help protect those areas. I think those are the two main key things that this was going to happen. I think the other big thing we really wanted to be part of was part of the vigil. So Christian Climate Action had set up places where they would sit, and people would sit down, they would wear a ribbon around their neck with a sign on it, and the sign would be about proclaiming peace. And we would sit in prayer, meditation with them. And I think on one morning we arrived at the Blue Zone. The Blue Zone is where all the delegates were going in and out of the COP26. A lot of security around. But because they passed by there, that's where all the actions were happening. That's where all the protesting was happening. And to see us in prayerful response for them and the actions that they might take was a real blessing to them. I know that, Michael, you had a conversation with a few people from Africa, didn't you?
Yeah, there was lots of people taking pictures, and most people were walking past. But these two ladies, they were African and they were delegates, actual delegates. They come up and wanted to have a photograph, and one of the girls actually took one of the signs and stood there for a bit. So I said to her, I was really proud of what you're doing. You know, we're really behind you and praying for you. How was it going in there? And she says, they won't let us speak. All we can do is listen. And I felt really sad about that. You know, I think the delegates should have been heard. You know, probably they weren't the most important delegates, but they were still delegates and should have had their voice. So, yeah, she stopped with us and got some photos. Those are the ones that stood out to me. But they were young people, which was really good to see there, that most of the people were talking were young people who care about, you know, their world.
That's great, Michael, yeah. And that story about people not being given a voice at COP22 was very much apparent. We know since the end of it what the stats are, and actually 78% of all the talks that were given by white men from rich countries, when really the indigenous peoples of the world need to speak out, because it's there where the height of climate change was being felt most. For us in the Western world, the Northern world, we can take it in our stride a little bit more, but for those on the front line of climate change, they weren't given the opportunity to speak as perhaps they should have done. For me and Michael, spending some time kneeling or sitting in prayer as these delegates came in and went was a time of real peace for us, a time that we can reflect on the reason why we're there. And we know from the conversations with those delegates that really supported them. And we honestly believe that the result of us being there was that maybe some things were changed, maybe a little more rhetoric was made aware, and mainly that people could say really how they felt because of the protests that were happening outside.
Thank you, Andrew and Michael, and I'll go ahead and move us on to part two. Susan, did Andrew and Michael want to speak to anything based on that, or shall we move ahead?
I think if it's all right with Michael and Andrew, we'll move ahead and let you do the rest of your presentation. Andrew has said he would be with us for the conversation to answer questions, and he can share a little bit with us then. Is that all right?
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
All right. Well, and thank you, Andrew and Michael, for sharing those pieces with us in terms of your experience with it. I look forward to hearing some of the responses. I'll probably have a question or two for you myself when I get that opportunity here later today, or perhaps even during the conversation in a couple of weeks. Okay, well, I promised a part two, and here we go with it. And again, I'll be monitoring for those questions as they come up, and with Susan's help, I'll try not to miss any of them here as we proceed. I think that, you know, when we consider the challenge with the international community, with national governments, I mentioned that little metaphor of the engine here. We understand that for real progress in terms of what we're looking at, we have to kind of look at the whole picture. And if we only focus on national governments and the international community, we're missing a large part of it because the civic organizations, I think including this one, and then also for subnational governments and yes, the private sector, we have to understand that there are massive things that are happening there right now with enormous potential for change on this issue and related issues. So something for us to consider in that as we proceed with it. So when we consider the piece there about challenging the system, changing the system, well, ultimately disruption might be the most proven method of changing society. And that comes through things like technology that I was speaking about next, but also social changes and ultimately the policy choices that are influenced there. All right, well, let's give that consideration for it. So let's talk about disruption and a little bit the history of it here first. I want to share with you a little bit from Tony Seba, who's a professor at Stanford University, one of our leading thinkers on this idea of market disruption. He's also a co-founder of a group called Rethink X, which I'll allude to more here in a moment. Tony Seba likes to talk a little bit about the history of market disruption and how things may come along to upset society a bit more quickly than you might realize, particularly in terms of technology. So oftentimes, I'm seeing some of his work, he leads with this picture. So run back in your mind to the history of the automobile. And if you go back to Easter morning in 1900, if you're there on Fifth Avenue in New York City, your task here, with a little help from that circle in red, is to spot the automobile. Hopefully you see it quickly. And ultimately, when we think about that, the challenge in us understanding the world in 1900 was that it was very much the era of the horse and buggy. There's one automobile there surrounded by a sea of people, but also animals providing the propulsion for the vehicles of the day, the buggy. When we think about that, when we think about automobiles in 1900, not that they started in that year, they'd been around for a couple decades, courtesy of Daimler, Benz, and some others. But really, in the year 1900, an automobile was a very rich person's toy. You had a cost that was multiple thousands of dollars for purchase of a vehicle, which would be well over $100,000 today in equivalent. And certainly the idea that that would be widespread in 1900 is impossible for us to imagine. We know the automobile gains traction from there, for pardon the pun. But we also have to understand that our traditional thinking about that is that you're seeing something like neat, linear, predictable growth, that it would gain a little bit over time before eventually achieving dominance decades and decades later. Well, the patterns of market disruption help us understand that linear growth curves are not usually what happens with the truly disruptive technologies. In fact, it's nonlinear, exponential, even explosive growth that is the hallmark of truly successful disruptive technologies. So let's look at the next picture. Easter morning, 1913, same spot, Fifth Avenue in New York City. This time, spot the horse. Let me know when you found it. Trick question, of course, you won't find it. Fifth Avenue, New York City in 1913 was dominated by the automobile. How did that happen when it was a rich person's toy? Well, you can thank Henry Ford a little bit with his Dearborn, Michigan factory, if you like. Once he started cranking those out in 1908, any color you wanted, as long as the color was black, famously, you saw what we often see in market disruption. If demand is there, then you're going to see the cost steadily drop from $2,000+ for an automobile back in 1908, all the way down to $400 for an automobile by the year 1920. This is the reality of market disruption. And this is one of the most famous historical examples to consider. But there's a pattern there that we're going to be chasing for the rest of this presentation that I think is worthy of underscore, not just for this example, as well as a couple other historical examples, but our current reality. All right, transition by market disruption. The pattern continues in a couple other ways. For those of us, really for most of us, I think on the call, you probably remember taking pictures with your celluloid film and the like, and being able to develop that someplace. Well, for me, Kodak was the synonymous term with that. You take the pictures and the like, they would go get developed, they'd come back and you can add them to your photo album. And that little picture there on the left, good pictures cost less in the parking lot, talked about the value and the like that you could get to have your cherished moments developed by Kodak. Well, that was the reality really all the way until the early part of the 21st century. If you think about Eastman Kodak as far as a stock value, valued at $40 per share with more than 75,000 employees in that year, Eastman Kodak was one of the best, most predictable bets in terms of the market. It was nice and steady Eddie forever in the course of it. But then something changed. Something was disruptive. That, of course, was the rise of digital photography. By 2015, Eastman Kodak's value dropped to 78 cents per share with 18,800 employees. Why did that happen? Well, they made their bet on old technology and they stayed there. They didn't revolutionize with the times. They didn't see the rise of digital photography in advance enough that they could change their business model and the like. And now, of course, I mean, heck, I don't even need a digital camera. I just got this thing, right? In terms of my cell phone, I've got a great camera in there. It's everything I need. It takes great digital pictures. I can store them out to infinity seemingly. That is disruption. That's a pattern of disruption to consider. And then we think about that in that classic moment of photomat disappearing and the like from our society. Look at the next one. And this one, I think, makes a nice visual for us to consider using that graph. So way back in 1985, the dominant telephone company in the United States and really in the world, AT&T, hired a company called McKinsey & Company. McKinsey & Company is one of those great data analytics forecasting firms, and one that has the opportunity to be able to make predictions that businesses will look at and give careful consideration of. Well, McKinsey basically told AT&T that by the year 2000, 15 years into the future at that point, there would be about 900,000 mobile phone subscribers. That was the estimate, and they should basically build their business model around that. They could predict that kind of growth. That's what they expected. Well, they were off a little bit. By the year 2000, there weren't 900,000 mobile phone subscribers internationally. There were 109 million. So you're off by a factor well over 100. That's disruptive technology. That's the reality. And as you can see the plot there on the graph, mobile phone subscriptions were puny all the way through the mid-1990s, and then you can see them take off and rise exponentially. Look at that S-shaped curve. That's exponential nonlinear growth. When technologies get on those kinds of S-shaped growth curves, they tend to stay there. And they tend to grow a lot faster than any kind of predictable linear growth pattern. So let's apply that to something maybe a little more relevant to the conversation today. Not that we all don't have cell phones, but you're here for other reasons and you hear me go on about that. When we think about energy policy, it's as subject to technological disruption as anything, right? And when we think about the last 20 years, what we've really been doing through policy, imperfect and oftentimes patchwork and the like, we've basically been pushing this giant weight to the top of the hill, that giant weight being renewables that in and of their own volition 20 years ago, they weren't competitive. And I'll show you that in terms of the proof here in just a moment. But steadily, countries like Germany and elsewhere, and even here in the United States, yes, and some imperfect actions, we've been pushing those up the hill. Well, what's the thesis of what I'm sharing with you from here on out for the rest of the presentation is that that massive weight now sits perched at the top of the hill. As of 2020, you have this massive volume of renewable energy. The policies have worked. We have push factors such as environmental and social goals, ESGs, targets, and subsidies that have been driving this energy transition steadily for the last 20 years in the background. And what we need now ultimately is going to be regulatory change to activate the pull factors of economics, to allow for gravity to do what it does, to bring that big stone rolling downhill. There are obstacles. There are things like fossil fuel subsidies that are in the way of that thing accelerating as fast as we need it to. But ultimately, if we're successful in clearing those obstacles, the hard work is done. We don't really have to lift the thing to the top of the mountain anymore. It's there. All it needs is a nudge and a little bit of the clearing of the road. So much of what we're talking about with pull factors, getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies, putting a price on carbon, for goodness sake, that's going to allow for those obstacles to be cleared and for what will likely be an avalanche over the next decade to 2 decades to commence and to really wipe out fossil fuels and to replace it with what we're all hoping for, which is much cleaner energy. So if that be the concept, let's see the proof of it. And we'll talk a lot about this in terms of that impending avalanche of cheap, abundant renewable energy. Irina refers to the International Renewable Energy Agency and a report that I'll bring up a couple times here in what's next, as well as Rethink X and some others as we proceed. Okay, but first, before we get to any of that, and maybe a little indirect shout out to Andrew and Michael here, we have to turn to Oxford, which, yes, is indeed the preeminent school, right? And when we think about this argument that has just been laid out by Oxford in the empirically grounded technology forecast and energy transition, this is an article that's yet to be peer reviewed. So understanding that a little bit in terms of limitation, but the numbers that they present here, I think, are truly fascinating. What you're seeing here are charts that plot ultimately how market forces are disrupting fossil fuel dominance. And these first 2 charts, on the left, we have solar, on the right, we have wind. So let's talk through a little bit of what you're seeing here. If we take a look at the graph on the left, when we consider solar, if you go back to the year 1980, the beginning of the graph there, and if you can see there, it has 10 to 0, 10 to the first, 10 to the second, 10 to the third. So the numbers go from 0 to 10 to 100 to 1,000 and beyond. If you go back to 1980, if you wanted to have a megawatt hour of solar PV put in there in terms of the cost for the levelized cost of electricity, the LCOE, the cost of that would be several $1,000s. Absolutely not competitive with fossil fuels, with coal, with oil, with almost anything really. So in 1980s, solar photovoltaic was a gimmick effectively in terms of market economics. But the reality is that steadily over the last few decades, that price has dropped. It has reduced down below $1,000 by 1990 and into the 2000s, you can continue to see it drop. By 2010, you'll notice those little red lines coming out. Those are cost projections from the International Energy Agency, for example. And their argument in 2010 was that, yes, solar PV was going to continue to drop, but that it wouldn't really reach $100 per megawatt hour, something that was really competitive or even better than what we would see for fossil fuel electricity generation until we get into the 2040s and maybe even out to 2050. That was their argument just 10 years ago. Well, if you recall from my last presentation, that argument was just simply dead wrong. The cost of solar PV has continued to drop in that nonlinear exponential manner. And now we're looking at here in 2020 costs that are well below $100 for every megawatt hour of solar PV that's installed in terms of the levelized cost of electricity. And the projection, note that blue, dark blue shaded area with the little blue dashed line, that's probabilistic Wright's law forecasts that says that it's going to continue to improve. And if it follows that pattern or better, possibly, for the cost of the levelized cost of solar electricity, we're talking about $10 for a megawatt hour, down from thousands just a generation ago. That is absolutely game-changing stuff in terms of what's available. That makes solar vastly cheaper than anything. Even right now, solar PV is simply the cheapest form of energy in the world right now. That's just in the last 5 years it has become so. It's cheaper than coal. It's cheaper than anything else. Imagine what happens when we reduce that cost by a factor of 7, 8, or 9 over the next couple decades. That becomes social change out of necessity for it. And look at wind. Similar story for wind. Back in 1980, not competitive. $500 for a megawatt hour installed. And the forecasts back in the 1990s and 2000, 2010, we're all talking about, yeah, you're going to get down below $100 there in terms of it, but it's going to be out there a ways. Now, the reality is wind has done better than they forecast. One of the truisms in renewable energy is that just like in climate, when we see that the doomsday scenarios oftentimes and what we fear is worse than we had previously forecast, well, in technology with renewables, the news has been consistently better than our forecasts. That's because the methodology of the International Energy Agency and others has been so conservative. They assume that, well, there's been some drop, but it's going to plateau out. That has not been the case. It has not been the case at all. And it goes against what we know about established nonlinear growth curves for technologies. Once they get on those curves, they tend to stay there. And this is definitely a case of it. Let's jump to a couple other technologies here. Again, from Oxford, If we look at on the left, you're talking about lithium ion batteries, the capacity cost for a kilowatt hour here in 2020 dollars. Now, if we think about lithium ion, there's really two that are plotted there. One is the consumer cell. Back to my cell phone as the cheap prop here. This runs on a lithium ion consumer cell. The laptop computer I'm presenting to you by is powered by a lithium ion consumer cell. Most everything that you have that's powered by electricity in terms of your devices is likely powered by a lithium ion consumer cell. And back in 2000, the cost of that was well over $1,000 for that consumer cell. But again, look at the black dots. Follow them down the curve here. By the time we get to 2010, you're well below what we're looking at in terms of $1,000, and you're closing in on $100. And that reality for that consumer cell makes it extraordinarily cheap and reliable in terms of what we're trying to do. Lithium ion EV battery pack, that's the red dots there. That, of course, is more expensive because it's so much bigger. The amount of lithium ion cells I need to power this, I'd need 10,000 of these for one EV pack in terms of the lithium ion cell. So of course the cost is much bigger. And even as recently as 2010, you're talking about something that was well over $1,000 for that consumer pack, or for that EV battery pack rather. But look at the cost, it has dropped precipitously. Now you can thank Tesla and Elon Musk if you want to. I think the credit is probably broader than that. But the reality is those costs have dropped rapidly. And what we're looking at now in 2020 is a price that is effectively right knocking on the door of $100 per kilowatt hour of capacity for lithium ion cells. And it's going to continue to drop. Probably you're looking at something that by the time we get to 2050. And so something to consider. A good question there from Diane, and I want to note that there in it. Lithium ion or lithium is limited, correct? Yeah, and absolutely, lithium is limited. But what we have to understand is we have enough lithium, according to Kingsmill Bond, who I'll share more about in a moment, to create, 1,000 million automobiles. To basically replace every car right now with EV packs, so those really intense lithium ones, we could do that with what we have in terms of the world's proven lithium reserves. That may not be a favorable thing to do because lithium is either harvested through open air evaporation or through pit mining, both of which have their problems. But the reality is too, as you point out, are there other options? There are. When we think about lithium, the harvesting of that is something that is continuing to develop. When we think about different forms of electricity for lithium or different battery packs, we can start to think about things that represent iron air batteries or aluminum air or a variety of other technologies that are just kind of on the start of their own process for this. So there are other options. They're out there a little bit. Lithium is king at the moment, but even the way that we extract lithium is going to change. Let me throw this at you. 20 years ago, I bought a manual 6-shift automobile. Today, I can't find one to buy. 50 years ago, you would have bought a carbureted engine. Now it's all fuel injection. When we think about those technologies and how they change, the reality is that technology continues to advance. I think we should have every expectation that not just the harvesting of lithium will become greener and more sustainable and therefore more plentiful, but also that other technologies will rise to challenge lithium over time. It's a great question. Another one here as well. Solar and wind didn't fall in cost. It was made to fall by investment. Absolutely it was. Yes, good. I agree. And I think that has to be pointed out in terms of the United States investments and the like for it. And yes, and our mistakes 50 years ago in terms of quashing solar investments nearly come back to haunt us. And we're only now starting to see what could have been possible with more investment. I think that's a great question, great point. And it's one to consider that we have to understand. That comes from Erica, thank you. And definitely one to consider in terms of the value of investment. If you don't do that hard work up front, lifting that stone up the hill, as I talked about through policy and investment, then you don't reap the rewards of these new technologies. All right, and electrolyzers, last one here in terms of this slide. Electrolyzers, we're really talking about green hydrogen, which has a lot of potential as a technology, but compared to the others is much slower to roll out. We're not there yet. It's not cost competitive in terms of comparing to lithium ion, but there are some promising pieces to consider with it. So again, note the cost curve from Oxford there. You're talking about something that is thousands of dollars for a kilowatt hour of storage using electrolyzers and green hydrogen. Well, look at what the cost plot has done. Now in 2020, it's just passing under $1,000 per kilowatt hour. And if it continues on that, if it gets down below $100 per kilowatt hour by 2050, or possibly even better if we're really lucky and through investment, then you're talking about a true game changer. If you're wanting an alternative to lithium, green hydrogen is enormously attractive. Lithium can store electricity for hours and days to an extent on an industrial scale if you really invest heavily in it, but for the most part, we're talking about hours. But with green hydrogen, if that process continues, you're talking about renewable energy pushing electricity through water that separates it out into hydrogen and then out into the other portion of it in terms of the chemistry. And then you have electricity stored not just for hours, not just for days, but for weeks and months. And for industrial applications, consider, I'll mention the name Andrew Forrest here in a moment, but consider the potential that's there for heavy metals and refining the like, if they have a way to get a lot of renewable energy and then store it for those days when the sun isn't shining or when the wind isn't blowing. That's really fascinating stuff. It's not there yet, but it too is on a cost curve that just means with investment continuing that it's a matter of time. All right, market disruption is explained by Rethink X. This is Tony Seba's outfit. And something to consider here that I think is that is probably going to push your thinking quite a lot. And certainly, I think it's out there on the leading, maybe bleeding edge of thinking. But if we want to be aggressive, let's consider their argument for it. A couple excerpts to consider, and you're welcome to read all of it, but I want to point out the one at the top there that is underlined. He mentions in this, or rather the report mentions this idea of technology disruptions that are already underway in the energy, transportation, and yes, even the food sectors, which I don't address in this presentation, but it's fascinating nonetheless. They have extraordinary implications for climate change. These three disruptions alone, driven by just 8 technologies, can directly eliminate over 90% of net greenhouse gas emissions worldwide within 15 years. Now that's out there. That's radical kind of thinking. But if you take this out to the most optimistic scenario, if we continue to see markets disrupting, if you continue to see governments investing, if you continue to see demands by the international community, I think that's the outer edge of what is possible. And when we talk about 90% net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions globally, you're talking about not just keeping 1.5 degrees Celsius alive, but as a reasonable expectation. So something to consider. And that would be well in advance of even net zero projections by 2050. This is much more aggressive in terms of a scenario than that. And something to consider. I mean, as it says at the bottom, societal choices matter. Technology alone is not enough to achieve net zero emissions. We need to have good policy. We need to have good consumer behavior in addition to those investments to make that all possible. So there's one to kind of rock your mind a little bit. And I'm, again, happy to take questions as they come in with it, but I'll continue for now as you form those. I mentioned the name Kingsmill Bond a few times earlier, and I want to bring him kind of to the fore here because I think he has some great graphics and explanation of much of this concept. So Kingsmill Bond is the Chief Energy Strategist for Carbon Tracker. Remember that thermometer I showed earlier? Former market analyst and strategist for Deutsche Bank and Citibank. He's the author of the Renewable Spring Report, which is much the center of part of this presentation, included in those links that I started things off with at the outset. Bottom line for him, he points out here that the most logical assumption, those learning curves, those exponential growth curves will continue. And that this is extremely significant because if you assume that growth continues, then these technologies will get incredibly cheap, far cheaper than fossil fuels and far more effective. And the ripple effects of that can be truly transformative, not just for climate, but for society in ways that we're only starting to be able to anticipate. So something for us to consider. If his projection is correct, and when you think about market disruption, all these technologies are on that growth curve. And as long as we continue with what we're doing policy-wise now or advance that, those growth curves will only accelerate. Well, let's see some of the proof of it. And to dig in a little bit to Kingsmill Bond's argument as we come close to the end of the presentation here, I wanted to share these with you now. Phases of energy transition by sector. If we think about the phases broken out into these different ideas in terms of spring and summer, autumn, and then winter, and then to leave things off with gestation as well. Using the penetration of new energy technology as of 2019, when we think about the gestation stage, that's getting up to about 1% of the market, including this. So in heavy industry, we're at about 1% of the market that is using renewable energy in terms of refining steel or doing some of that heavy industry work and the like. I mentioned the name Andrew Forrest earlier. And there's a link, I think successfully came through, and it's there on the right for it a little bit, is the idea that decarbonizing heavy industry using green hydrogen is now technologically feasible and desirable. Countries like Australia, who have enormous potential for wind and solar, could use renewable energy if they're able to build it out enough, not only to make green steel, but also to create those electrolyzers that we want, green hydrogen that could become its own export market. It could become a more effective kind of battery energy storage in the future. But that's all in gestation mode right now. It's very early on. If these phases take anywhere from 10 to 15 years, well, we're still several years away from heavy industry getting into the phase of spring, right? We think about building heat, which is now better than 1%. And when we think about building heat that's from renewables, hopefully you're all thinking about heat pumps. If you don't have one at home, highly recommend it. We love ours. It's one that's super energy efficient, does a great job heating the house, even to sub-freezing temperatures, right? And building heat now we're starting to see tick up in terms of market share. EV car sales is more established than that. Globally, you're looking at 4% of total car sales are electric. But note that it's starting to get to the end of spring. It is continuing its growth in that. And pretty soon, in a matter of a few years, and think about all the options that are out there from not just Tesla, but through Ford, through Hyundai, through a variety of other automakers that are now committing to really electric-only vehicles sometime in the next decade. And we're also starting to see with summer there for electricity generation, renewable energy being better than 10% of the global supply. And in some parts of the world, well above that. So these are the phases of energy transition. It's not winter yet. We're not looking at mature technologies, but we're also not talking about something that's 30 or 40 years from now. We're talking about that over this decade and the next decade, these will all advance pretty dramatically. And we'll start to see the market competitiveness of them. And the growth really is going to these areas. Traditional fossil fuel powered economy, those investments are just starting to dry up. And that money is going here. More about that in just a moment. If we think about it as far as countries and regions, on the far left there in gestation mode is the CIS, or the Commonwealth of Independent States. Think Russia and all the stans and the like for it. That rather large nation in terms of it, and Commonwealth is largely a giant petrostate in terms of its most valuable commodities. So it's very much at the earliest end of this. But if we look at what's happening in a variety of countries of Africa, in terms of renewable energy, where you're starting to see 3, 4, 5% of market share that is looking at renewables and clean energy. That's something that's established already. India, China, Japan, Morocco, and the United States that fits kind of right there between Japan and Morocco. You're starting to see those areas with 10, 11, 12, 13, 14% for the United States in October 21 of our energy generation that was coming from renewable energy nationwide. We're on a growth curve. It's non-linear. It's going to be explosive. And look at where Germany and Denmark are. They're in autumn. I mean, they're kind of their own category, and they represent much of Europe. Denmark, that is getting now better than 60% of its electricity is coming from renewables, shows the potential. 10 years ago, they were very much in summer. Now they're leading the charge. And we're going to be following them with the investments and the like that are out there, and not just from governments and the like, but from other entities, those entities that are driving the engine, as we'll see again here in a moment. All right. Well,
we do have a comment in the chats if you'd like to check on that.
Well, great. Yeah. Thank you, Susan, for the reminder. And seeing that from Peter, as we make the transition, many companies are still using business as usual mindset in their attempts at green technology by placing wind farms in ecologically sensitive areas, looking at profit maximization only, and still looking at ecological disruptions and externality. I absolutely agree. We can't have the disruption of some of our most environmentally sensitive areas, even with renewable energy. About a mile from where I work at Bellevue High School, the Sound Transit light rail system is going in, and will be going through testing starting in this month, really, but it won't be open for customers for another year. But to do that, they essentially plowed through part of a sensitive wetlands that is tragic. I mean, we're taking cars off the road, but we're effectively converting areas that were sensitive in terms of Maidenbower Bay and the like into something that would be rail stations. So we have to do better than that. And I think you're absolutely right to point that out. We can no longer look at ecologically sensitive areas as externalities. So we have to push, and that's part of the reason to continue to push for it, sure. And businesses will look at this. They will see this as a financial opportunity, and it's up to us to make sure to continue to push them in the direction. It's going to happen, though. And I think that's something for us to consider in terms of where we're going with it. How can we shape that? That's policy that needs to happen to prevent the disruption of our ecologically sensitive systems. But I think as well, to help us understand that those areas are ones without our interference that can do a great job in terms of capturing carbon. Wetlands and the like can soak up massively more CO2 emissions than can even established forests. So we need to push that model. We do. I'm with you. If it were up to me, we'd be talking about carbon coin currency. But of course, they haven't given me that kind of power yet. So I'll keep you posted. So private capital, let me address this. And I saw another question just come in. Can private capital be counted on to reduce emissions? Honestly, up until this past year, I was enormously skeptical. But what we're starting to see here, and I think what comes out of Glasgow, this Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, is that the private sector is no longer looking at green technologies and saying, yeah, that's a gimmick, I don't want to put my money there. They're starting to look at this to say that disruption is happening. You're seeing the growth. And it's always cheaper for investors to get in before the train has completely left the station, right? And what we're looking at now is that train is beginning to accelerate. So they want on board. And when we think about GFANs, as it's kind of referred to, we're talking about a group of companies and investors internationally that has assets exceeding $130 trillion. That's real money. And their goal, what they intend to use that money for now in terms of finances and the like, they're going to be using those assets to back this transition, a transition to net zero by 2050 at the very latest, covering all emission scopes, direct emissions from companies, but also indirect emissions, with interim targets and transparent progress reporting. That's the promise. Will they deliver? Again, a year ago or so, I would have been really skeptical that this was greenwashing. But now when you hear, I mean, listen to Mark Carney, go take a look, see what they're doing, see what role they've been playing, see how high-level climate action champions from the United Nations says that the private sector could deliver 70% of the financing we need for this transition. Suddenly, you're not just talking about national governments that have to bankroll this. Suddenly, you're talking about this being profitable. And when that happens, good, bad, or otherwise, you know that it's going to accelerate on those nonlinear growth terms, those growth curves. Yeah, from Kathy Sharp, I believe Portugal has also been a worldwide leader in greening its energy. Absolutely. Again, not an all-inclusive piece in terms of the chart, but just for representation. So I totally agree. Yeah, and I agree. Peter, back to your point there, we absolutely need to look deeper at what people are doing, not just what people are doing, but institutions like these businesses, and certainly with national organizations. I mean, New York State just made a big announcement this past week that they're going to be going forward with increased offshore wind locations that are going to help them meet their targets. That's tremendous news in terms of renewable energy and reduction in terms of CO2 emissions for that state. But it's also one where we have to look at that carefully and see where are they going to put it? What's that going to do? What impact will that have? And it's something that we need to make sure that we're tempering that with. And who's going to benefit and who will not? Great points. So then, if civic groups, the private sector and subnational governments are the engine, what role are the national governments playing? And I guess to some degree as well, the international community. Well, for us to consider this and to kind of play it out a little bit, those national governments are increasingly the caboose, if we can kind of complete the metaphor here in terms of it. And when we think about that, we have to understand that those national governments, they do still have the power to hit the brakes, and they are frequently. They could also let the engine accelerate the transition to clean energy. But right now, for that transition, yes, we're seeing the brakes applied too much, but we have to remember as well, and this is from Kingsmill Bond News, our inner paper, that really you've got about 20% of the global market in terms of customers represented in countries that are still dragging their feet heavily. Think the fossil fuel producers, like the United States, which has really yet to put out effective national policy in this regard, like the petrostates in the Persian Gulf and elsewhere. But the thing is, they can't stop it now. Kingsmill Bond's conclusion is clear. They might be able to slow it a bit, but they can no longer stop it. It is beyond their power to do that. So national governments may hit the brakes considerably, but the reality is more and more policymakers in those countries that we're seeing on those growth curves, Portugal, Denmark, most of Europe, China, and elsewhere, they're seeing the potential of this. They know that the new technology is not just coming, but it is basically here. And they know that if they don't get on board now, that they're going to be punished by the markets. And that's something we have to consider, that we have to embrace, that we have to push for the best possible result in terms of what's best for the environment beyond just global CO2 emissions. But it's one that is happening and is now unstoppable as far as a force. Can we get there fast enough is the challenge. Can we clear the obstacles out of the way? That's what we're considering in terms of the obstacles ahead. So takeaways, just to sum up, and I include this slide. I didn't really do this last time in my presentation, but I think given I've thrown so much at you here, it is kind of merited. Let's consider this for just a moment. If we look at takeaways for the work ahead, because we all have work to do, it's my high school teacher and me that I'm going to give you some homework on this. You shouldn't be surprised by that. The Conference of the Partners in November showed that progress was made, but more is urgently needed. We know that 2.7 degrees Celsius projected increase by 2100 would be the result of action on current policies. That's an improvement, sure, and it has to be viewed as such, but it's not enough. We need to continue our push. Now is the time more than ever to continue that push. We know that civic groups, the private sector, and subnational governments have become the engine driving changes needed to address climate. And we know that market disruptions, they're going to intensify quickly. The 2020s are going to be increased disruptions in this regard as they accelerate up that non-linear growth curve and accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels. That's going to happen now, no matter what. It's just a question of how much time is it going to take. And we know that national governments are the caboose. They're applying the brakes too much to meet those critical goals, but ultimately we're the ones that can force them in that. And ultimately, we're the ones with our homework that will be in charge of pushing for that. We're the civic organizations. We're the ones that are going to push our elected leadership and say, move in this direction, move faster, but move smarter as well. Make sure that we're doing this in a way that is sustainable. That has to be part of it. That has to be part of our policy going forward. So to finish up, last time out, I was happy to share a little bit about Spencer and his moment addressing the Seattle School Board. Well, I got to bring Theo in this here as well. And whether you're engaging in Scotland, like our courageous advocates and Andrew and Michael, or if you're closer to home, literally in our own backyard here in our neighborhood, like my son Theo, we must continue to push for change. Last summer, Theo joined me in doorbelling. Primary endorsements, yes, through the 34th Democrats, but whatever your organization is, this is a chance to push for this in terms of change. Theo helped me out, and there's nothing more effective than having a young, bright face at the door for people to want to talk to you. Push for change, continue to push. Keep going with it. This is our opportunity. No longer is the wind in our face with this. We're not having to roll the rock uphill anymore. Now the wind is at our back. We need to rig the sails and allow it to push us forward. So I want to thank you for your time and attention today. I'll stop the share there, and I'll be happy to re-put these or place these key references and citations in there again, in case you missed them earlier on. It's been a great pleasure to present to the group, and I'll stop now for any questions you may have.
Thank you, Randy. Oh, amazing. I really am fascinated by all you've shared with us, and it is very hopeful. There are a couple of comments in the chat. I'll let you look at those and comment on those in any way that you like. And then let's go ahead and take five or 6 minutes for additional questions if anyone has some. I noticed one of them had to do with Canada and the US, you know, and anyway, I'll let you look at those. And then Randy, if you could put up that last screen again while you answer some of those questions, that would be helpful.
Can do. Yeah, I actually just posted that into the
in the chat.
But I'm happy to put that last screen up there again for reference if you like. Let me bring the chat space back up, because whenever you share, suddenly everything disappears. So just briefly, and I want to scroll back up because I think Kathy sent me a question earlier that I missed in the flow of the presentations. My apologies. And this might be one that goes a little bit beyond my preparation for the presentation, but how are the delegates selected? I'm assuming she's referring to Glasgow and the Conference of the Partners. Who decides who gets to speak? Do they not have consensus methods or small groups to ensure all delegates have an opportunity to express their views? That's a great question, Kathy. I'm not sure I can answer that here. I'd be happy to defer to others who may have an answer on that. I can look into it if you'd like, but ultimately, I think that the ideal version is that you do get the chance for everybody to express their views. But practically, not always the case. Probably the big countries and their delegates are going to elbow out some of that conversation oftentimes. So I don't have a great answer for you on that. I apologize, but let me see if I can come up with something and get back to you a little later on with it. Scrolling back ahead, there's Portugal. We had a research piece. Research is also being done, this is from Marcia Darling, is also being done using plant and bacterial cellulose production interlaid with copper wiring for allowing electron flow transmission in batteries. They evidently have achieved very useful, suitable results versus lithium ion. Yeah, absolutely. And what you're looking at right now, there's that gestation phase that I showed earlier. That's where all the ideas are happening. Some will fail spectacularly. Others will become something that gets established on that next growth curve. And I think in terms of batteries and that challenge and the limitations of lithium and the like, there's a whole host of things that are there that may well be competitors. And we've seen ideas come to fruition in the past along these lines. We've seen others that have not. I'm fascinated to look into that one as far as plant and bacterial cellulose production. One that I think is kind of along those lines is getting really geeky here for a moment with you, nanotechnology. When we consider this idea of moving items that have nanometer in terms of their size for it, that is one 1/70,000th the thickness of a human hair, that we have the ability to manipulate that now in limited capacity to create the ability to make better batteries. If you think about the anode, the cathode, and the iode down the middle with it, you have the ability to create better batteries in the course of that would have many times more kind of production. And kind of duration in terms of the ability to hold on to a charge, retain that, and store more energy, and to be able to discharge not just 1,000 times, but many thousand times without losing any capacity. So yeah, there's a lot of tech that's out there. With nanotechnology, that's something that we've heard about off and on for 10 years. Well, it's still in gestation mode. That cycle can take a while. We'll see where things go over the next several years. Investment would certainly be helpful. Great, and I see Linda Phelps' question there, late coming in, curious about where the United States and Canada stand. I focus mostly on the United States here. I think for Canada, I'm going to defer to my previous presentation, so I might invite you to take a look there in terms of where they are. But their carbon pricing is well ahead of the United States based on the last presentation from October. And we have the opportunity to hopefully pattern ourselves off that as we go forward. Canada, in terms of putting a price on carbon, has done something very important. It's limited in some capacities, and different states like Washington State have recently put in their own Climate Commitment Act that effectively puts a cap in terms of it, cap and investment model in terms of the amount of pollution that can happen. And we're just starting to see that one roll out as far as the rules and the like, and it'll go into effect here a year from now. So there's a little bit for you, something that you could reference in my previous presentation if you wish, but there's more out there too. I got that last screen up there, indeed. And from Diane Weberly, if we're wanting to invest in new technology, how would we go about deciding where to go about that? Ooh, great question. And I think, you know, I'm not going to give investment advice. That is way beyond my charge and probably my ability as well. And in some of those things, I defer to my spouse, who's been interested in a couple of things in that regard. But I think, you know, if you start digging into green technology a little bit, there's a lot out there to consider with it. I'll see if I can find some links that would be along the lines of it. Inside Climate is one of the outlets that I read quite a bit. There's a host of others in there. And think about too what's going on with Ford, with Rivian, with automakers that are increasingly embracing EVs. Those might be things to research in terms of it on the front end for it. Great, and from Diana here, how will fuel shortages and the transition to electrification impact progress? Like there's a return to coal production to cover shortages, how long will it last? And you're seeing this question right now about, because of the variability in renewables. I mean, there's times when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. What do we do in that situation? And I think what you have to understand is as we go through this transition, yeah, there are going to be bumps in the road. There's going to be those challenges as far as electrification. But we also have to think too about, you know, events like what happened in Texas just under a year ago. The storm that knocked out power there and the claim that that was because the wind turbines couldn't hold up to cold. Well, we have to understand that wind turbines deal with colder temperatures than that all the time in the Midwest, in Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma. They had the same storm, but they didn't lose power from their wind turbines. That's because they winterized their turbines. And Texas did not under ERCOT's authority. They went with the cheaper route. So I think that when we look at that as far as fuel shortages and those sorts of things as far as covering it, for now you still exist in a model where peaker plants, coal or natural gas plants are there to kind of replace that energy when you have shortages. But we're starting to see the increase in terms of batteries and their ability to do that and other technologies. It's a transition time. The other way to work around that is if you think really big. Right now we have kind of three grids in the United States. You have the East Coast, you have the West Coast, and then you have basically Texas or most of Texas through ERCOT. Well, those are somewhat separate entities in terms of it. You can't really move power from Boston to Seattle right now, not in any kind of an effective way. And you certainly can't move anything from those areas to Texas very effectively. If we intertie those networks, and if we focus on that, then suddenly you're looking at a situation where excess power in the desert Southwest from solar or excess wind from the Great Plains, where the wind does literally always blow in Nebraska and Kansas. that power can be shifted around to places that are having shortages, that can't make up for that demand because the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. If you think about big grids, then those are ways to compensate for that, even without batteries for the most part. Okay, what are the prospects of a carbon tax? I think of prospects of a carbon tax at the state level in the United States or at the provincial and even national or federal level in Canada are favorable. I think it has run into some problems here and there, but ultimately it's going to be one that we're going to have to look at in some capacity. I think with a methane fee, which functions a lot like a carbon tax, except it's for methane, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there, that if you can remove methane from the conversation, we can buy ourselves a lot of time in terms of climate impacts. And that is currently part of the Build Back Better bill. It has been passed by the House of Representatives. We're literally a couple of votes away from that happening in the Senate. Those are very reluctant votes, as you've probably followed, but we'll see where that may go. So as far as a carbon tax and its prospects, you have that in existence in countries in different parts of the world, but not consistently yet. In my opinion, it's a simple, effective method that I hope that we're going to be able to see. Great, and we'll make this our last question from Diana. She speaks in under the wire for time. What are the prospects for small-scale distributed generation on the city or community level? I think the promise of that is tremendous, because when we think about small-scale distributed generation, we're really talking about microgrids. Instead of thinking about like Seattle City Light, where I live, is one big utility that runs it all. When the power goes out in areas, you have blocks and blocks and blocks that are effectively knocked out. Well, when you get into small scale stuff, whether that's generation from my rooftop, as I think I mentioned last time, I have solar right above me there. But if I have battery backups for that, that's great for me. But if I can tie that into a microgrid, literally having that grid be part of a broader network, but that can be sealed off from other outages, then that's really promising. I think that on the city and community level, there's promise in certain places for that right now. It's a ways out, but I think as far as the technical feasibility, we have the technology. And honestly, we have the finance. It's just the political will and the demand for it. And that can be part of our focus too. That'll make more resilient communities. You're starting to see that show up in places like California, which due to wildfires, when California PG&E was shutting down the grid, microgrids in certain places allowed for those areas to be resilient and keep the power on in their neighborhood when much of the rest of the state was out. I think that's going to grow in terms of demand. And there's some capability there that's really promising. Okay, I'll shut myself off there. I could talk all day, but it's coming up on 3:30. I've definitely taken my chunk of time. So thank you everyone for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure.
Randy, it's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Rod for our closing statements.
I wanted to thank Randy for a great presentation, lots of information. So you may want to take a second look at that. It will be up on our website in 2 or 3 days. So thank you again, Randy. What I want to do is just take a few more minutes, first of all, to remind you that the follow-up conversation, this went very quickly, and a lot of really valuable material that we probably want to digest and pursue further. That will be in 2 weeks, as noted on your screen, and Randy will be joining us to answer questions. And Andrew Fellows will be there if you have any questions regarding the activist side of things. And then February is tentatively, as noted, in case you weren't here at the beginning, we're hoping to have a session on eco-racism, extremely important topic in terms of the whole process, but it's been hard to nail a date, so we're not 100% sure on that. What I wanted to do in close is in some respect, merge the two aspects. Today, we've been talking wonderfully about the market mechanisms and the political mechanisms that are at play. Those are those two big systemic issues that we have talked about. And you can see the scope and the potential for change. We are also, though, a religious organization, and we have this sense of who we are, ontology, who we will be, our sense of all as children of God, our sense that it should be about the flourishing of life for all. And so that brings into play that other aspect that we have been considering, especially with the prayer vigil, is our place within that. For sure, we can do all of these political and economic things, and we need to be well informed. And even President Vesey has said that a prophetic people has got to accurately discern the true realities. And this is exactly part of that process. But part of that reality is to ensure that we're all seen as equally children of God, and that it is the flourishing of life for all that includes not just all people, but our brothers and sisters in the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom, because it is from that perspective that the true sense and discerning ability to know how to balance all of these aspects come into proper alignment. In that light, then, I want to close with one of the pieces of music that we played during our vigil, and then just a closing thought. And so I simply want to leave you with that notion that we have this marvelous opportunity. This is, in fact, an incredible moment to be here. Yes, of course, it can seem daunting, but there are such potentials, and that is because God's spirit of goodness is always at work, coaxing all to life, whether it is in these technological advancements, the political advancements, or again, trying to find our sense of place within this and how we advocate the proper sense of checks and balances. That is can be an incredibly invigorating challenge and opportunity, and it is one that good spirit of life calls us to. So let me close with a couple of words from our favorite poem, "Go fly, do it now, I will join you." Thanks for coming. Go in peace, and we hope we will either catch you in 2 weeks or at the next chance you are able to, and or go up on the website and listen. Over.